What you're about to hear isn't speculation, it isn't cable news noise, it is documented, verified, and frankly alarming. And the people in Washington who are supposed to protect you knew about it long before you did. There is a secret arrangement playing out right now between Beijing and Tehran, and it goes so much deeper than a handshake or a trade deal. We are talking about a shadow military alliance, one built in silence, constructed through denial, and executed with breathtaking precision. Iran secretly acquired a Chinese spy satellite, the TEE-01B, built and launched by the Chinese company Earth I Co., and it was acquired by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' Aerospace Force in late 2024 after it was launched into space from China. Let that sink in for a moment. While diplomats were talking, while negotiations were happening in rooms in Oman, in Rome, and Geneva, behind all of that, China was quietly handing Iran the eyes it needed to watch every single American soldier stationed across the Middle East. The IRGC received access to commercial ground stations operated by Empasat, a Beijing-based provider of satellite control and data services, giving Iran the ability to direct the satellite's operations from anywhere in the world. This isn't a rumor. This isn't a talking point. The documents exist, the timestamps exist, and the consequences. American aircraft destroyed, American bases targeted with precision. Those are real too. This is the story that changes everything you thought you knew about the current balance of power in the Middle East and about what China is truly willing to do when America's back is turned. Now let's slow down and really understand what we're dealing with here, because this story demands that we think carefully. When I look at what has unfolded between China and Iran over the past 18 months, I am struck by something that I think most analysts in Washington are either too afraid to say or too politically compromised to admit. What we are witnessing is not a series of isolated transactions. It is not simply China buying cheap Iranian oil or Tehran looking for a weapons supplier. What we are witnessing is the deliberate construction of an alternative world order, one transaction, one satellite, one missile deal at a time. Following the 12-day war between Israel and Iran in June of 2025, the Iranian government accelerated negotiations with Russia and China to procure advanced missile systems. According to reports from the Financial Times and Reuters, these talks persisted even after the international arms embargo was reinstated in September of that year. Think about what that tells us. Iran just came out of a devastating conflict. Its nuclear facilities had been hit. Its military leadership had taken catastrophic losses, and yet within days, Tehran was back on the phone with Moscow and Beijing, not begging, negotiating from a position of enough leverage to keep those conversations going even under the weight of an international embargo. That should tell you something about the relationship that had been built long before the bombs started falling. Russia and China are not obligated to defend Iran if it is attacked by the US and Israel, as they have no mutual defense treaties, though the three countries signed a trilateral strategic pact in January 2026 to strengthen political cooperation and deepen economic integration, a trilateral strategic pact. January 2026, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. And yet the American public was barely told about it. The American media was too busy covering domestic political drama to spend more than a few minutes explaining what that pact actually means in practice. I'll tell you what it means. It means that we are no longer dealing with a unipolar world where America can pressure one adversary at a time. We are dealing with a coordinated bloc that shares intelligence, shares weapons, shares economic lifelines, and shares a common strategic objective to make American power projection in the Middle East and beyond increasingly costly, increasingly difficult, and ultimately unsustainable. The Pentagon report on China's military released in December stated that as of 2024, commercial satellite companies based in China had participated in business exchanges with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now pay attention to the language there. Commercial satellite companies. That is the cover. That is how you do this kind of thing when you want to maintain plausible deniability. You don't have the People's Liberation Army sign a contract with the IRGC directly. You route it through a company, a civilian company, a company that, on paper, just provides satellite control and data services. But according to a former CIA analyst focused on Iran, the arrangement amounts to a dispersion strategy for Iran's space assets. Iran's satellite ground stations, which had been hit in 2025 and 2026, can be struck with missiles from 1,000 miles away. But you can't just hit a Chinese ground station located in another country. That is the genius of what China did here. By routing Iran's satellite capabilities through Chinese commercial infrastructure, Beijing effectively wrapped those assets in a protective shield. Attack the ground station and you're attacking China. Attack the satellite and you're attacking Chinese commercial property. It is a masterstroke of strategic ambiguity, and it worked. The satellite captured images of Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia on March 13th, 14, and 15 of 2026. On March 14th, President Trump confirmed that U.S. planes at the base had been hit. 5 U.S. Air Force refueling planes were damaged, 5 American planes destroyed or damaged, and the intelligence that put those weapons on target came from a Chinese satellite. Let me say that again so it is completely clear. American military assets were destroyed using targeting data derived from Chinese space-based surveillance. China did not fire a single bullet. China did not launch a single missile. But China's technology, China's infrastructure, China's deliberate decision to provide Iran with that satellite capability in late 2024, that is what made those strikes possible with the level of precision that was achieved. Iranian commanders reportedly tasked the satellite with surveilling key U.S. installations using time-stamped coordinates, orbital data, and imagery captured in March, including before and after drone and missile strikes on those sites. Targets included Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, regions near the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, and Erbil Airport in Iraq. Every single one of those locations is a node of American power in the Middle East. This was not random. This was not opportunistic. This was systematic, methodical surveillance of the American military's regional architecture conducted with Chinese tools in service of Iranian strategic objectives. And when you lay that out in plain English, it is impossible to describe it as anything other than a covert act of war against American military forces. Now, here is where it gets even more complicated, because the satellite story is just one layer. On February 24 of 2026, Reuters revealed that Iran is negotiating a separate arms agreement with Beijing for the supply of CM-302 anti-ship missiles, the export version of the YJ-12. The missile travels at supersonic speed and can hit targets as far as 290 kilometers away, making it a threat for warships and shipping in general, particularly in the congested Persian Gulf and nearby Strait of Hormuz. We are talking about a supersonic anti-ship missile that could fundamentally alter the naval balance of power in one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz is not just important to Iran, it is not just important to the United States. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow passage. Every country in Europe, every economy in Asia, every market that depends on Middle Eastern oil has a stake in what happens there. And China is on the verge of handing Iran the weapon that could hold that entire waterway hostage. U.S. intelligence also indicates that Beijing weighed transferring air defense systems to Iran, potentially routed through third countries to obscure direct involvement. Routed through third countries, again, plausible deniability. Again, the fingerprints are carefully obscured. This is how China operates, not with the blunt directness of Russia, but with a kind of calculated, patient sophistication that makes accountability almost impossible to pin down. By the time you can prove what happened, the strategic damage is already done. China is preparing to deliver new air defense systems to Iran in coming weeks, according to 3 U.S. intelligence sources cited by CNN, as the U.S. and Iran are within the window of a 2-week ceasefire. In response, Trump said Sunday that if the reports come to fruition, the United States will enforce a staggering 50% tariff. A tariff. That is the American response to China potentially delivering advanced air defense systems to a country that just spent months targeting American military bases with Iranian missiles guided by Chinese satellite imagery. A tariff. I want you to really sit with that contrast for a moment, because it tells you everything about where we are strategically. The tools of American leverage, economic pressure, tariff threats, strongly worded letters, are increasingly mismatched to the nature and scale of what China is doing in the shadows. Trump said he wrote a letter to Xi Jinping asking him not to provide Iran with weapons, and Xi responded saying that China was not supplying Tehran. And Trump, to his credit, made that exchange public. He did not pretend it didn't happen. But think about what it reveals. The President of the United States had to write a personal letter to the President of China asking him to stop arming an adversary that was actively targeting American forces. And China's response was essentially, we're not doing that. Meanwhile, the satellite documentation, the missile negotiations, the naval ships shadowing American carrier groups in the Arabian Sea, all of that is happening in real time. In the current crisis, a Chinese scientific research ship arrived in the Arabian Sea in January 2026 and has shadowed the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group. Russian and Chinese naval vessels participated in naval exercises with Iran, and a Chinese maritime space tracking ship, escorted by a Type 055 class destroyer and a Type 052D destroyer, recently arrived in the Gulf of Oman. Let that image sit with you. A Chinese destroyer escort in the Gulf of Oman, watching American carrier operations, tracking American missile defense activity, while back in Washington, American officials are crafting tariff threats and waiting for responses to diplomatic letters. This is the gap, the enormous, dangerous gap between the strategic reality of what China is building and the political response that Washington is capable of generating right now. And I say that not to be cynical, not to be defeatist, but because understanding the gap is the first step toward closing it. You cannot solve a problem you refuse to accurately diagnose. And for too long, too many people in positions of authority in this country have been unwilling to call what China is doing what it actually is. It is not competition. It is not economic rivalry. What Beijing is doing with Tehran is the construction of an anti-American military architecture funded through oil, built through proxy commercial arrangements, and weaponized through the denial of direct involvement. China has no interest in its forces directly confronting Americans. That will come later, but it has significant interest in Iran and the surrounding area and must act to protect its investments and its reputation as a dependable partner. Read that sentence carefully. That will come later. The people who study China's long-term strategic behavior understand that everything Beijing is doing right now, the satellites, the missiles, the naval presence, the trilateral pact, the dark fleet oil trade, is preparation. It is positioning. It is the patient, methodical construction of leverage for a confrontation that Beijing believes is eventually inevitable, even if Washington has not yet accepted that reality. China's role in global conflicts, and more specifically negotiating potential arms transfers with Iran, is nothing new, according to Yun Sun, a senior fellow and director of the China program at the Stimson Center. She said that no one should be surprised that China will rearm and rebuild Iran down the road. No one should be surprised. And yet here we are, surprised, or at least performing surprise, because the intelligence community has known about the trajectory of this relationship for years. The 2026 Annual Threat Assessment, the Pentagon's China Military Power Report, the intelligence on the radar systems, and the missile negotiations, all of it was building in classified and unclassified channels long before the Financial Times ran the satellite story. The 2026 Annual Threat Assessment warned that China is far outpacing other nations in its development of space-based capabilities. Beijing's rapid deployment of space capabilities positions it to use space to advance its foreign policy goals, challenge U.S. military and technological superiority in space, and project power on a global scale. Space is not a separate domain in this conflict. Space is the domain that makes everything else possible. The precision of Iranian strikes on American bases wasn't achieved because Iran suddenly developed world-class military intelligence on its own. It was achieved because China handed Iran a set of eyes in orbit that gave Tehran capabilities it could never have built independently in the timeline that mattered. This is what modern warfare looks like. It is not always tanks crossing borders. Sometimes it is a satellite launched from Chinese soil, transferred to an Iranian military force through a commercial company, and used to track the movements of American pilots so that missiles can find them on the ground. Commercial Chinese satellite imagery revealed the deployment of U.S. THAAD missile interceptors in Jordan, so it is wise to assume China has deployed its spy satellites to give Iran more detailed information on Israeli and American forces in the region. THAAD deployments, one of America's most advanced missile defense systems. Its position in Jordan was known to China through commercial satellite imagery, and once China knows, given the documented relationship between Chinese commercial satellite operators and the IRGC, how long before Iran knows? How long before the adversary who is trying to target your forces knows exactly where your defensive systems are positioned? This is the intelligence sharing ecosystem that China has built, and it operates continuously in real time using commercial cover to insulate it from accountability. Moscow and Beijing will continue to seek deals with Tehran, seeing lucrative opportunities addressing various capability gaps in the Iranian security forces. Lucrative opportunities, that is one way to put it. Another way to put it is strategic investment. Russia gets drone technology tested in Ukraine back from Iran in the form of Shahed drones. China gets access to a partner that ties down American military attention and resources in the Middle East, keeping Washington focused on a region that China views as a distraction from the Pacific theater, which is where Beijing truly intends to compete. Every dollar spent, every carrier group deployed, every diplomatic hour consumed by the Iran crisis is an hour that American strategic planners are not spending thinking about Taiwan, about the South China Sea, about the technological race in artificial intelligence and semiconductor manufacturing that will ultimately determine which country leads the world in the second half of this century. That is the real game. That is what you need to understand when you hear about this China-Iran deal. It is not just about Iran. It is not just about the Middle East. It is about Beijing making a calculated bet that if it can keep America perpetually bogged down in Middle Eastern conflicts, bleeding treasure, losing credibility, rotating exhausted carrier strike groups through the Gulf of Oman, then China can continue its patient, systematic rise without ever having to fire a shot directly at an American soldier. The satellite does the work. The missile deal does the work. The oil trade through the Dark Fleet does the work, and China maintains its position of, as its foreign ministry spokesperson said, playing a positive and constructive role. The audacity of that framing is almost worth admiring from a purely analytical standpoint. China provides the satellite that helps Iran target American bases. China negotiates to provide the missiles that could close the Strait of Hormuz. China shadows American carrier groups with its naval vessels. And then China's foreign ministry says it is playing a constructive role, and that reports of arms transfer are groundless smears. This is the playbook. Deny, deflect, continue, and repeat. And it works because the international system does not have an effective mechanism for holding a nuclear-armed permanent member of the UN Security Council accountable for covert military assistance to a third party. What happens next is the question that should be keeping American strategic planners awake at night. Because the ceasefire between the United States and Iran is fragile. The negotiations are stalled. On April 7, 2026, Iran and the United States announced a temporary 2-week ceasefire. 2 weeks. That is the margin we are operating in right now. 2 weeks of quiet while China continues its military relationship with Tehran, while missile negotiations continue, while the satellite continues to orbit overhead, collecting imagery of American bases. If that ceasefire breaks, and there are serious reasons to think it might, the conflict that resumes will be taking place in a strategic environment fundamentally shaped by everything China has done in the shadows over the last 18 months. Iran will have better intelligence. Iran may have better air defenses. Iran will have the knowledge that, however isolated it appears diplomatically, there is a great power behind it that will not let it collapse entirely because China's strategic interests in Iran's survival are too significant to abandon. That is the world we are living in right now. And the question for the American people is whether the political system is capable of responding to it with the seriousness and clarity that it demands. Because what has been revealed in these documents, in these intelligence assessments, in the satellite data and the missile negotiations, all of it points to a fundamental shift in the architecture of global power that is not going to be resolved by a tariff threat or a strongly worded letter. It is going to require a genuine reckoning with the fact that the era of uncontested American primacy is over, and that the challenge of managing China's rise while protecting American interests and American lives is the defining strategic problem of our generation.